Michelle D. Miller trained as a cognitive psychologist specializing in working memory, memory encoding, and the psychology of language, earning her PhD from UCLA in 1997. After leaving UCLA, Dr. Miller was a postdoctoral research associate at Rice University, studying memory processes in brain-injured individuals and helping to design functional magnetic resonance imaging studies of brain areas involved in working memory. She continued to study memory after joining the faculty of Northern Arizona University as an assistant professor. Then, over time, turned her research efforts towards investigating effective online and face-to-face learning activities in college courses. Today, Dr. Miller is someone you will probably recognize as a kindred spirit in that she wears many hats. She is the director of the First Year Learning Initiative, professor of psychological sciences, and President's Distinguished Teaching Fellow at Northern Arizona University. She co-created the First Year Learning Initiative at Northern Arizona University, and she is active in course redesign, serving as a redesign scholar for the National Center for Academic Transformation. In 2014, Harvard University Press published her book, Minds Online, Teaching Effectively with Technology. The book has elicited praise, including a strong review in the Chronicle of Higher Education by teaching expert and author James Lang. Minds Online continues to generate interest from readers who are attracted to its clear conversational style and practice evidence-based strategies. Members of the UC Faculty Institute Planning Committee and today's session's presenters each received a copy of Dr. Miller's book, and it was that planning committee that selected Dr. Miller for this event. It is with great pleasure that I now hand the podium over to Michelle Miller. Please join me in welcoming her to the University of Maine System and to UMA.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction and for the opportunity to speak today at this exciting and, I hope, also engaging event. All right, so, I'm here today to talk to you about teaching, right, especially teaching with technology. And you got a great sense just now of the perspective that I'm bringing to this. So I did train as a cognitive psychologist and worked on really theoretical issues early in my career, but then, like you, I came to work in an institution that really deeply prizes and values teaching. And that historically really pushed out, if not on the very cutting edge, it was on the leading edge of new methods of delivery and new technological aids, such as fully online, blended, and hybrid instruction. So, that is what got me interested in this idea of bringing the best findings of my science, of my discipline, to bear on age-old teaching problems as well as new opportunities that we have. And of course, this idea of bringing psychology to teaching is not a new idea. This has been around for quite some time, and lots of people have called for us to bring a better evidence basis and more learning science into what we do. And yet, I've found from my perspective as a psychologist that a lot still gets lost in translation, right? And this is, partly because learning science, cognitive science, like any discipline, has its jargon and its inside baseball. But it's also because of the sheer volume of the research and the findings. It seems like, hundreds and hundreds of new findings, new articles are now coming up and piling up in journals every single year. And it's hard, even as an insider to that science, to figure out what's the most relevant, what actually applies, what actually helps me make the decisions about what I'm going to do and not do in my classroom, face-to-face and online today. And it's funny, in a way that reminds me of technology, educational technology itself, and the situation with that. I mean, there was a point, perhaps, where the question was not so much what will I choose, but wow, is there some technology out there that I could possibly use to help me do what I want to do? But now the situation is different, right? I don't know about you, but I open my email in the morning and it seems like 5 new tech companies have popped up and they've got 10 new products that are going to solve all of my problems, and wouldn't I please adopt all of them? So here too, it's a question of winnowing down to what is the most valuable thing that I can take with me today. So, that has been a core purpose in the writing and the speaking and the working with faculty that I've done, trying to pull out those core principles and help people make informed choices that fit their discipline their style and their students the very best. And so that's what I want us to be thinking about today as we work together. And so at the core of today's talk, I'm going to talk to you about and kind of unpack and demonstrate to a certain extent 3 major areas of cognition, kind of a framework from my discipline that I think are really the most helpful and the most critical to understand as teachers, and that do help us narrow down and make those important informed choices in our technologies and our approach. And I'm going to also turn those into some concrete suggestions about how to implement and apply the principles that do flow out of those 3 key areas, and how we can leverage those for our students using instructional technology and sometimes more general approaches that also work in face-to-face. So I'd like you to see these ideas as a starting point and as a framework for further ideas that you're going to generate today and over the summer and in the rest of your practice. And, you know, I'm a firm believer in 2 things. First of all, that you are the best source of those new ideas that are going to work for your students in your context and your discipline. And also, as you'll see in this talk, pulling back the curtain a little bit to students and making them our allies in understanding why we take these approaches, and so we can leverage these principles of the mind together for more learning in less time for more students than ever before. So we're going to have that, as I said, be the central part of the talk today, but we are going to have some demonstrations as well. I understand that this is a crowd that is very game for interactivity, so we're going to have some discussions and a few demonstrations, as you'll see in a minute. Now, many of these, as you'll see, what I've also put together is this website, and we'll probably be sharing this link at some point as well. Oh, here we go. Nice if we could actually see it. Here we go. There you go. Okay. So resources for the talk. References, instructions, other ideas, links out to materials. All these are collected on a site that you can access later. So hopefully that'll take a little bit of the pressure off today and let us really focus on unpacking and getting involved with these ideas. Okay? So with that idea in mind, with that little preview in mind, I was thinking that maybe today we could start out on a fairly light note with a little game. All right, are we perhaps open to that possibility? All right, good. I see 1 thumbs up, so I'm good to go. So here's what I'd like us to do. Don't worry, this is not one we have to get up and circulate, so we can stay comfortable. I'll tell you a little bit more about the purpose of this and weave this throughout, but here's the game itself. We'll just call this the movie lines game. So this is something that I put together based on a game that we used to play in my house growing up as a kid, invented by my uncle Hal Miller, who was a drama teacher for his whole career and, as you might imagine, a real fanatic for movies. And we would play charades and things like that all the time, but you can't play charades all the time, so this was our alternate activity. So here's what you do for the movie lines game. First of all, everybody, I'd like for you to think of, and you can jot it down if you want, but you don't have to. Think of, if you can, a line or a pair of lines from any movie. But the catch is it has to be something you think you can remember verbatim. All right? So I'm going to let you kind of cogitate on that for a minute. And the game that we'll play for just a couple of minutes when everybody's got one in mind, if you can remember one, is this. So you can just throw up your hand if you'd like to share your line. You'll have to project it for the whole room, but share your line out. Just say your line, and the rest of the room will see if we can guess what movie it came from. All right? Sorry, what? Make my day. Oh, make your day. Well, I'm trying. Okay. We are ready to go. Okay, so, and it came from? Dirty Harry. All right, well, let's just go then. All right, give me another line. Yes, to the back. Now, I should say that when we play this as a classroom demonstration, sometimes we stipulate that it's PG-13 lines only, and that's when you see all the students kind of scribbling out their lines. All right, G-rated movie, and it's an acceptable line. All right, so no herpes here. What is that from? I don't know either.
An everlasting peace.
An everlasting peace, okay. Yes?
Luke, I am your father.
which one? Empire Strikes Back. All right. Give us another. Yes, the black shirt. Oh, there's no crying in baseball. From A League of Their Own. Yes.
1.21 gigawatts.
I don't know, but I like it. Where did it come from? Okay. Yeah. Nobody puts baby in a corner. Do you know I hear that one all the time from students today? They still love it. And yes, one more for the man in the pink shirt. You can't handle the truth. From A Few Good Men. All right. Great. So you have an amazing memory for these lines. I mean, it's been a while since, I don't know about you, but since I've seen some of these movies. And you remembered them perfectly, well enough to where other people could even identify the movie it came from. All right? Very good. So, since you have this amazing memory, what was the second sentence that I said when I stepped to the podium just 5 minutes ago? Presumably, nobody has any idea, right? Okay. So you have a perfect, or at least very, very good recollection for these movie lines. We can kick them back and forth all day long. And nobody brought up The Princess Bride, which is good because we'd still be here in a few hours. But you don't know what you just heard 5 minutes ago. So let's think for just a second about why that is. Let's throw up their hand and with an idea. Yes? Okay, so there's some role of repetition, especially if it's a famous movie line like Make My Day, or it's one that we all like, so we're going to talk about the lines together. Yes?
We have no emotional connection to what you're saying.
Not yet. All right, but yeah, the emotional connection. Yes. Okay, so maybe there's some consolidation that had to happen just as a function of the time. Sometimes something being recent should help, but maybe there's something else that has to happen in the meantime. Yes.
It also wasn't like a standout. Like we can all quote one line from a movie, but like we can quote every line from a movie. You know, there's always like one standout line. But
Right, so it's not like you just recorded the whole thing in your brain for the movie either. And yes, one more.
And in the list of priorities of what we remember and what we don't remember, was that really on each one of our lists of priorities to remember?
Yeah. So something about prioritization. All right, and yes. Yeah. All right. Yeah, I didn't alert you or focus you that, although you probably understood more or less, you probably remember more or less what I said. You probably remember more or less of everything that you've seen this morning, including the early bird session if you went to that. So there's a distinction here too between the level of detail and exactly what you remember. So this is something that I kick off a lot of my face-to-face classes with, and actually I challenge you to see if you might be able to fold this into an online environment as well. And the purpose here is to get us thinking about how our minds actually work and why we remember what we remember and how we bring together our resources to produce these interesting patterns of recollection. So it's all about introspection and reflection on exactly how the mind works. And it isn't as simple, as you know now, if you didn't before, as just having something in front of you and experiencing it, right? There's a lot that goes into why we remember or encode what we do and what we don't. So with that, let's start thinking about those three areas of cognition. And some of these points that were brought up were absolutely, I think, spot on with respect to memory and to attention. These are themes we'll weave back in during our time today. So when I think about these three areas of cognition that I really want to share with you today, first off is this idea of attention. And when I started, by the way, looking at the learning science and teaching guide books that were out there, I actually found that very few of them either started with attention as a central aspect of learning and memory in general, or they didn't talk about it much at all. But, you know, as a cognitive psychologist, when I think about your mind's attentional functions, I kind of think that whenever something interesting goes on in cognition, in your thinking processes, it's like attention was first on the scene. And we've learned a great deal about how this works in the mind and in the brain. So I think that this is one thing that all teachers should know about and be thinking about as we construct our materials and our learning experiences. And especially when it comes to memory, the connections there are very, very strong and powerful. So, of course, that second component that we ought to be thinking about as teachers is that memory piece. Now, you know, I always have to kind of qualify this and avoid, you know, getting anybody on the defensive by saying that, of course, I don't believe, and really nobody I know who's serious about teaching, believes that memory, memorization, just building knowledge is the sole aim of teaching, or even perhaps the most important aim, right? So, but with that in mind, I think more people who are serious about teaching and learning are starting to say it's okay to be thinking about memory in our teaching. And it's all right to expect our students to acquire a knowledge base as part of what we do. Now, given that, we don't want that to completely take over our course and our teaching. So it's a very, very good thing that we do know a lot now about how to make this happen in a lot less time. So leveraging what applied memory researchers have uncovered about the best ways to quickly and efficiently build a knowledge base, I think is really advantageous to us. And then lastly, there's this piece, the thinking piece. Now, when you talk to people who are, again, serious about teaching and learning, if you ask them, what do you most want your students to have at the end of the course, this is what they talk about, right? So if you were to ask me, for example, what do you want your Psych 101 Introduction to Psychology students to have at the end of this course? Sure, yes, I do want them to know about the landmark findings and some key terms and facts and fictions about human psychology, but more than anything, I want them to start thinking more like me, right? More like a behavioral scientist thinks about behavior and the mind. I want them to be able to weigh evidence the way that I do. So that's something that we really, really want, but like so much in life, just wanting it is not enough to actually get it. And what's very easy is to have that content knowledge really piece start to predominate in the course. And while that content knowledge does support thinking skills in an area, we've found, of course that's not sufficient. Just knowing about all the landmark findings that other psychologists have come up with does not enable me to weigh evidence the way a psychologist does. So I need to be very deliberate about building that. And while that's never going to be easy, as we've found, we do here again know a few things that make it at least a little bit more accessible and easy to get to. So those are some of the areas that I'd like to share with you today. All right, so starting with that attention piece. Now, one of the funny things about research and attention, and the study of attention, is that, at least in my opinion, we don't have a really clean, non-circular definition of what attention is. And attention researchers, people who do this for a living, don't tend to talk about attention in terms of span. Okay, you've got a 5-minute span, you've got a 3-minute span. I mean, it's all very contextual. And they use other kind of heuristics to talk about how attention works. There's no one attention spot in the brain that just switches on when we're paying attention as well. But that said, we now know so much about how attention works. And we definitely know what attention is for. All right, so attention is about, like it says up here, prioritizing. So given that we only have so many cognitive resources to go around to handle what's coming in at any given time, we have to prioritize, and attention is that set of structures and processes that allows us on a millisecond by millisecond basis to change our focus, to divide our resources up among different things at any given time. So that's what attention does, if not what it actually is. Now, a couple of really key principles to keep in mind about attention. First of all, is this deep connection to memory? Now, there's an old school of thought, and one that I still buy into, that says that for all intents and purposes, very little new learning goes on without conscious, focused attention. All right, so you have kind of this narrow window of conscious attention, and only so much fits through that window, and if it doesn't go through that, you're not going to form a new memory or learn something new. You can kind of activate and use old things that you already have stored away, but not build new information in your mind. So that's, I think, a really important, and so it gets our attention as teachers, for sure. So also in the study of working memory, as that has evolved over the last several years, if you're familiar with the concept of working memory, that's the being able to hold information we're using right in the here and now to do a task. That's a form of kind of short-term or immediate memory. There's a school of thought right now as well that says that working memory is essentially attention. It's just sort of what you're paying attention to internally. So that kind of blows your mind to think, wow, working memory is maybe not a spot to put things or hold things. It's just what you're paying attention to at any given time. So that's important stuff. So attention has a deep, important connection to memory. Now, I think the next things that we can think of, though, are this practical side of, okay, we only have so many resources to go around. We shifted from one thing to another, moment to moment, trying to maximize our resources. So what gets in the way of doing this efficiently, especially in learning situations? Well, first off is this concept of cognitive load. Now, how many people have heard of this concept or have some familiarity? Okay, great. So this is a really well-informed group with respect to cognitive load. The jury, I think, is still out on exactly how cognitive load theory is going to be developing. I think that it's still a work in progress, but I think it does tell us that very important practical point that in a learning situation, there's a certain amount of cognitive capacity that's taken up just by learning a new grammatical form in my foreign language class, or trying to figure out and master a new statistical analysis, that kind of thing. But of course, then there's the extraneous load introduced by other aspects of the situation, especially those involving attention. So if I'm searching around in the learning management system and going, oh wow, where was I supposed to post my discussion response? And here's the instructions down here in my textbook, and I have to keep shifting back and forth. That costs out of this same kind of bank of attention and compromises how much students have left over for other things. So that's one important point. Now here's another that also taps into an old idea from cognitive psychology, but I think can really give us some new ideas for design of learning activities. And this is the concept of automaticity, all right, automaticity. So when we carry out a skill, do a task, it takes up a certain amount of attention, of course, but as we learn something very well, if it's something that we can sort of routinize over time, it starts to draw less attention. Maybe it always takes some, but those attentional demands can be reduced over time. So let me throw this out to the crowd just for some ideas. What are some examples of things that you've learned, perhaps? It took up a lot of attention initially, but then you notice that decreased over time, leaving you more left over for other stuff. Yes?
Multiplication table.
Okay, multiplication tables, right. So that in and of itself was a capacity-demanding task initially, and one would hope over time, then that becomes automatic and kind of comes out of that attention equation. All right, great example. Yes, in the back. CPR, okay. And what do you teach, if I could ask?
Nursing.
Okay, good. All right, so that was something that probably took up your whole focus initially. And then now you've got the basic steps down, and you can be juggling other things at the same time. And one more, yes?
As a society, I think driving.
Driving. Okay, so driving is a great example. So initially, just kind of keeping the thing on the road and putting your foot where it's supposed to be, that took everything. You couldn't be on the radio having the conversation and so forth. And so you probably felt over time, if you think back to learning that, how that changed. And this is something that we can, again, bring into our teaching, and we'll return to that in a second for some ideas on exactly how. So when we haven't mastered or made automatic those processes, yeah, that's going to change how much we have left over for higher things. And then lastly, there's this point, what I will call dysfunctional multitasking, and you can probably guess where I'm going with that. So sometimes it's also that we choose to kind of cram too many things into that limited budget of attention, either because those are simply the choices we made, or because we have some mistaken beliefs about how attention works. We may think we have more capacity than what we do. We may think, for example, that we can learn something passively in the background without focusing on it, or that, if something important happens in this class or meeting, I'll just sort of automatically tune back in just in time. So if we think that that's how our attention works, we can kid ourselves about how many things we can do at once. Now, thinking about how this flows into some concrete applications. So the first point, I think, is just to really be considering, have this on our radar as we design our learning experiences. Where are students' focus going to be? I mean, ultimately, it is up to them, right? Especially when we teach online, you can't go home with the students, and they do need to make their choices about focus. But at least having lots of opportunities and prompts to respond is one very entry-level way of gaining and maintaining attention to the learning materials at hand. Now, in a face-to-face system or class, something like clicker systems can help do this. So how many people, if you teach face-to-face, have ever tried a student response system, clicker, something like that? Right? Yeah, and there are even low-tech ways of doing this too with cards. You can have cards you can scan. There's lots of different twists on this. And student response systems are, they're a little bit of overkill in a small class, and they introduce some other complexities. But one of the things we found when we introduced this at Northern Arizona University in our Intro to Psychology class, very big, kind of lecture-oriented class, one of the things when we surveyed students about their clicker experiences, one of the things they said was, well, maybe I liked it, maybe I didn't, but this really helped me kind of stay focused and dialed into what the class was doing as it unfolded. So that's one way to do that. And when I started bringing this into my online course design as well, I found that this really was an important kind of tipping point or shift for me. So if, for example, we have a lot of reading for students to do, I don't think that's necessarily bad, but alternating that with lots and lots of opportunities, questions, whether they're multiple choice, opinion, short answer, anytime the students have to kind of weigh in and say, here's what I thought about that is going to have a beneficial effect in terms of attention. And sometimes we don't do this because we're worried about the grading that's going to pile up. But remembering that those low-stakes Q&A opportunities are there to engage students and not so much provide this big opportunity to have very detailed feedback. Something like spot grading or auto grading can make a lot of sense. So that's one, I think, initial point. Returning to that idea of automaticity, to reflect and say, well, what aspects of this skill, this discipline, what students are doing, do they maybe could they practice to a point where it doesn't draw all of their attentional resources or most of their attentional resources, can be beneficial as well. So as we think about this, I want to get a little bit more feedback as well. What examples might you be able to offer from the things that you teach? Pieces or parts that students really could and perhaps should have down cold. Right? I know a few from my discipline, but let's hear from yours. Some things that really should be or could be automatic for students, and once they are, leave them more left over for the conceptual side of the assignment. What do you think? Yeah. Okay? Okay, so the technology itself, right. If they practice that first and kind of get that out of the way, then they're going to have an advantage later, right? Yeah. Okay, verb tenses, right? So if we're not struggling with some basic composition, our ideas can flow more smoothly. What else? Yes? Okay. Scientific terminology. I know in what I teach, currently I do a lot of teaching about APA-style writing, everybody's favorite topic. and we're continually pushing students to integrate and synthesize and think about whether you covered the literature. And they're going, where does the comma go in this citation? And so if they haven't practiced that, then think about how much is competing with that conceptual side. So thinking about the automaticity. And, one of the affordances of technology is speed as well. We now have something we didn't have before, the ability to also look at how quickly students are doing assignments or pieces of assignments. So this may be, as it says up here, worth considering. For some assignments in some situations, incentivizing speed. It's the opposite of what we usually do, saying, okay, sit down, take your time. But I'll give you an example. One of my collaborators at NAU for many years was an electrical engineering professor named Liz Brower. She's now retired. But I worked with her for a while on her circuit analysis course and thinking about how to bring technology in and really boost what students were doing. And she would, through a lot of discussions, she said that, one of the issues is students not mastering some of these core principles, things like Ohm's law. Please don't ask me to explain that, but it's something that you need a lot as an electrical engineer. And yes, students will say, well, I can go look that up. And she would say, well, if you have to look up Ohm's law every time you go to deal with a circuit, you're not going to last as an electrical engineer. They need to know this stuff. So she set up assignments that would produce, it would generate lots and lots of different problems, all tapping into one central principle. Each assignment was built around, say, something like Ohm's law. And these were repeatable. They were not a one-shot thing, also a great principle. So students would work through these problems, but the twist was this. Your final grade that you made on that assignment incorporated not just how well you did on your last attempt, but how quickly, all right? So it brought in a little element of gamification and got that across to students that this is something you need to know down cold. You can't be looking it up every time. And once you've got this, we really open up a whole set of avenues of other things you can do. All right, so that's something that we can consider as we balance in that principle. And lastly, that piece about dysfunctional multitasking, right? I think here's a great opportunity to engage students on that idea of being, even if you're a so-called digital native, you do not have infinite capacity. And probably a lot more gets by you than you realize. Learning by passive exposure really does not work. So there's lots of good ways to engage students in those issues, and I want to share one with you in particular. So this is an ongoing project at NAU called Attention Matters. Now, Attention Matters is, as it says up here, it's a module that runs in BB Learn. It's open enrollment, so anybody at NAU, even faculty and staff, can just press a link and you're auto-enrolled in this course. There's no cost and there's no credit associated with it. Now, what this module does is it demonstrates to students, doesn't just tell them or send them off to read a bunch of research articles, it shows them that their attentional resources are more limited than they think. It informs them about some better ways to use their attention and some good study techniques, such as self-quizzing. And it also challenges them to think about, what's their plan going to be the next time they're in a class and they have a distracting neighbor, or they're tempted to pull out their phone when class is slow or when they're home and thinking about, well, maybe I can just watch this video at the same time as I'm doing my OChem homework. Does it work so great? So we've had about 1,000 students now go through the Attention Matters module. And you might ask, well, why would they voluntarily sign up to do this? And it's this. What we have is we've put this out to faculty, and many of them have offered extra credit, just a little bit of extra credit to their students, especially in foundational kind kind of 100 level courses for completing this. We run the module. Students get a certificate of completion, so even if they get assigned it in different classes, they don't have to do it multiple times. And to faculty, this has been very appealing because many faculty are concerned about this issue. They just don't necessarily want to spend 3 days of their own class time directly handling it. So that's one thing that we've done, and we're finding we have some interesting preliminary results showing that this module does significantly help students become more informed about how attention actually works and some better study strategies. So that is perhaps kind of the most elaborate way of engaging students in this issue. And as it says here, we're also very happy to share the materials and the faculty guide, and you're welcome to take all of it or any piece of it if you'd like to use it as well. So getting students on our side about this issue can also be really beneficial in our teaching. So speaking of that connection to attention and memory and how we go about informing students of this, I want to run now another little demonstration game. And this is one that is actually part of Attention Matters. This works really well in a fully online module such as Attention Matters. So for this, you're going to need a little bit of scratch paper. You don't have to turn it in, but this only works if you actually play along on paper. So this is another nice, easy softball memory task. So I'm going to ask you to draw out a very simple, unfortunately, very common object that you're all highly, highly familiar with, all right? So without cheating and looking at an example, I'd like everybody to just take a minute and draw a penny. A penny. A US 1-cent coin, any version, and if you're feeling ambitious, do the front and the back. Okay, so we're going to have to see who also has some spare change on them. So pull out an example, chat with your neighbor if you've got one, and let's see how accurate your drawings from memory actually were. Okay, let's have just a couple of examples. What was wrong with it? Yes? It was facing the opposite direction completely. You've seen the thing your whole life and you mirror imaged it. Yeah. All right, what else?
The 1 cent is on the back.
Okay, so it said 1 cent. We were right there, except we put it on the wrong piece. Yes?
Forgot United States of America on the reverse side.
Oh. Okay, yeah, United States of America. Yes? Oh my goodness, we didn't even trust in God. All right, so you looked at the thing your whole life. You've handled them your whole life. You understand what they are and what they're for. And yet you probably don't really have a good memory for what you've looked at all this time. So once again, why do you think this is? What are your intuitions about why? Yes? Recall versus recognition. Okay, so this is a good question. If you did this in multiple choice format, like if I showed you an array of different pennies, do you think you could pick out the right one? Okay. All right. Too bad I didn't bring my array because this is actually a implementation of a classic research finding by Nickerson and Adams, who did this actually in a very systematic way, not in this very free-form way we did it in here, and found not only very common errors, just like what was related just now, but also that people are pretty inaccurate too. If you give them an array of plausible alternatives, they still can't pick out the one where the head is facing the correct way, that has the right elements in the right place. So it may not even be just your recall or even your drawing ability. So here again, what are some intuitions about why? Yes?
Because on the dime, the head is pointing in the other direction.
Okay.
And it's brighter and shinier, so it may stick out.
Okay. All right. So there's something else that kind of, it was close, but it got incorporated into that. Yes? Yeah, you never used it. This was probably, I'm guessing, the first time anybody ever asked you to actively recall that. Yeah. You drew a wheat penny? Shields, wheat, yeah. Yeah, so there's different versions of it, yes. Yeah, print out what you don't need. So do we see some overlap here with the movie lines game? Yeah. So there are a lot of intuitions, and it does make a good discussion starter, which is what we do use it for in Attention Matters. And it's really wonderful because students, they don't have to in the module, but oftentimes they choose to post the picture, which is a lot of fun. And it gets us thinking, again, about how passive exposure as a tool for memory, for learning, for retention, is shockingly ineffective. Things like, recall, distinguishability from other similar information, I mean, that's part of it. But it really does bring home that focused attention on something is really useful for memory. Active recall of something is very useful for memory. And also one really important point about memory, which we'll get into in a second, which is, that the brain is really built for ruthless efficiency. And if it's not just taking in stuff that's in front of you, well, it's doing its job. It's doing its job very well, which is great until you're in a situation where you're not engaging with something that you actually do need. So that memory for a common object, that penny demonstration, does bring home some of those points, and in a way that, again, engages students rather than just kind of lecturing them about how they ought to be studying. And we aren't going to show this one today, but I would encourage you to check this out, maybe later today or on your own if you can. Another really key piece of material from Attention Matters, the amazing color-changing card trick, which leverages another kind of effect, a phenomenon in memory and attention to show students just how much gets by them when they aren't actually paying attention because they're on their phones perhaps or watching a video. And lastly, there's some researchers, if you want to unpack some of this research around attention and memory, those are some other places to go. So jumping into more depth in that memory topic. So as we have studied it and kind of our thinking has evolved about memory, this is what's really floated to the top. It's very exciting that we don't anymore think about memory as much as just a place to put things, just a big recording device, but as an adaptation. I mean, it's in there in the mind to help you solve problems and help you survive in the world. That's what it's there for. And when you think about memory in that way, then a lot of things do start to click and do start to become more intuitive and understandable about why we retain some things and not others. And while it's true that repetition, engagement, and rehearsal are important and useful for memory, it's also the case that sometimes we remember things for a lifetime that we never rehearsed, that we encountered one time. So it's not that simple, but goal relevance is one really big guiding principle. Of course, context, like a lot of aspects of the human mind, context, getting the right information back in the right situation is a principle the mind is built around, which is why, for example, cues are so important in helping us get information back out of long-term memory. Why you might know something, but given the wrong set of cues, it's, now you see it, now you don't, reinstate the cues and you can get it back. And lastly, the depth of processing effect, something we've known about for decades and decades in psychology and which has been leveraged in a lot of literature about teaching and learning. So depth of processing, you've probably heard of this principle before. It essentially says that what we do with information when it comes in has a lot to do with whether we're going to be able to recall it in the future. So it's not just how many times did you work with information, how much time did you spend on it, but what did you do during that time? With, of course, so-called deeper, more meaningful processing given the advantage. So some further principles to keep in mind, including some really practical ones from the research. First off is kind of a very down-to-earth one, which is visual superiority. So for most individuals who have typical seeing abilities, material that's presented visually, or even that we process internally in a visual way by visualizing it, tends to be very well recalled compared to other ways of processing or encountering the information. So this is usually true. So for an illustration, how many people have ever heard of or maybe even read the book Moonwalking with Einstein? Okay, only a couple people. So this I think it hit a bestseller list a couple years ago, and it's a story told by, it was written by, unfortunately, a journalist, not a psychologist. I wish a psychologist had written it, but he gets a lot of the research right. So he explores the world of memory championships. So people who treat memorization as a sport, they do things like memorize a whole deck of cards perfectly in under 2 minutes, something like that. And he tries this himself. He goes into it assuming that people who do this just have amazing, unusual abilities, but he finds out that at the heart of this is almost always a visualization strategy. So they have ways of making information visual and using that to get it to really, really stick so they can reconstruct it perfectly. So this is sort of one of those generally true principles. But we have to qualify and not run away with the idea that this is due to some people being quote-unquote visual learners. So getting into that issue is a whole talk into itself, so I wasn't planning on doing that, but just in a nutshell, cognitive psychologists tend to really not buy into this idea of learning styles. There's evidence and other reasons to believe that this is not a major determinant of why we learn better in some situations than other, individualized learning style. So don't worry about visual, auditory, kinesthetic learning styles, but in general, visualizability, visual presentation gives a memory advantage. Now here's two other important principles that I think everybody needs to know about because they're so practical and so well established in the applied memory literature. This is first off the testing effect. All right, so how many people have heard of this one, or retrieval practice? Okay, so this is starting to really make it out into the mainstream, which is great news. So the testing effect, or retrieval practice principle, is essentially this, that when we actively retrieve information from memory, when we take a quiz on something, or even something that's even like a quiz in any way, that has a very strong impact on our ability to recall it in the future. And in fact, it's so strong that this produces better results than almost anything else you can do in that same study time. So that's a big deal. This is not just one or two research projects. This is something that's been building up for years and years. In fact, we were starting to learn this back when I was in graduate school. The problem is we couldn't actually act on that principle because it was so hard to give pencil and paper quizzes and tests all the time, which is, of course, not the case anymore. So the testing effect is one important principle. The spacing effect, or distributed practice principle, is another. And this is also pretty straightforward. It says that it's not just what you do, but how much time you spend studying. It's also how you distribute your study time. With it being the case that shorter, more widely spaced study intervals tend to work a lot better than so-called massed practice, longer study sessions clustered together. So for example, if I've got 4 hours to study for a test, I'm going to get more out of that time if I spend it in 4 one-hour increments, or even 8 half-hour increments, than if I sat down for all 4 hours at once. Does that make sense? All right, so testing effect and spacing effect. So with those in mind, here are some applications that I think can be really powerful. So I think that if we're not using or harnessing this testing effect for our students, I think we're really missing out. So as we choose those tools, as we set up assessments and learning activities, setting up the ones that really emphasize this frequent small stakes quizzes is really beneficial for our students. And as I alluded to before, even if we can't go through and hand grade in detail all the responses, students will still get the benefit of that, since it's all about actively pulling information out of memory. Now, students, here's one where we really do need to get them on our side and pull back the curtain on why we're doing this. Students, like many people, are conditioned to think about quizzes and tests as what you do after you learn, not as part of the learning. But they can really come around to this mentality pretty quickly if you're up front with them and just say, well, you know, there's a lot of research that shows that you're going to get this a lot more quickly, even if you don't know the material well the first time you take the quiz, and that's why I'm doing this. So that's a great way to present this and build it in. Taking advantage of spacing, especially now that students can carry with them things like mobile quizzing apps, right? Encouraging them to do that. And this is also good news for our students, I feel, many of whom are juggling the family and the job and the full-time class schedule, to know that, hey, if you're looking to work with this material and start getting a knowledge base, It's fine to have 15 minutes here and 10 minutes there. As long as you're engaged, that's a good thing. So take that quizzing app with you to soccer practice, or work through your flashcard deck while you're waiting for the bus. This actually does really pay off. And lastly, pulling in those depth of processing and other powerful principles. Emphasizing things like synthesis in discussion, not just, okay, what are the facts? And trying to choose those visuals like meaningful diagrams, animations, illustrations, and building those into our courses as well. Now, there's a lot of research out there, and I'd encourage you to give it a look if you can, on multimedia theory that tells us exactly how to fit together things like visuals and audio, things like that. But some of the principles, we could pull out some pretty basic principles out of that. So first off, it's not enough just to put visuals in a course, right? You can't just sort of decorate it with pictures and think that learning is going to happen. But substantive graphics, especially if students can interact with those, or if they couple an audio narration with something like a dynamic process unfolding, that can get so much across in less time. Now, the reason why we don't often have those is because they're very tough to build, right? So I'll just editorialize here a little bit and say I think that we could do a lot to push our publishers and our tech companies to provide more of these materials. So be assertive. Tell them exactly what you need. And when we get those good visuals, good narrations, good diagrams, let's put them into our courses. All right, so pushing the powerful processing. Now last, of course not least, let's consider that thinking side of the class. So here are a couple principles to really remember. So first off, when psychologists talk about thinking, that is intentionally a very broad umbrella. That can mean anything from the formal reasoning that you might do in a logic class or a math class to practical problem solving that you might have in an engineering or nursing class, to things like spotting cognitive biases like you would do in a psychology class. And then everybody's favorite issue, critical thinking, which does span our curriculum. So there's a lot to this, and that's okay. It does mean, however, that we have to reflect on what we mean by thinking skills in our discipline, in our course. Now here's one big challenge, perhaps the biggest challenge in teaching thinking skills, and it's this. Because our minds are geared to give us the right skill, the right information, in the right context, thinking skills can be very context specific. Now, of course, we're all trying to equip students to think in any situation for the rest of their lives, right? That's what it really means to be a teacher in higher education. And yet we're kind of fighting the mind's natural tendency here. So time and again, we'll see students fail to transfer what they've learned, if not out into their lives and careers. We might see them not transferring from one course to the next, or from one chapter to the next chapter in the same course, or even one module to the next. So this is a big, big problem in our teaching, right? So transfer. Now, when we think about transfer, fortunately, we do have one good grasp, one good way of getting around the transfer issue. And that is that it does take repeated practice across examples that allow us to see the underlying structure of a problem. Now, when we talk about problems having underlying structure, and that's what students need to see and work with in order for them to transfer, it helps to, once again, have a concrete example. So I'm going to throw one out to you. This is a bit of a trite example, but it rings true for me, and I think it really illustrates this idea of drilling down to the underlying structure of problems to build transfer. So I want you to consider this everyday problem you might encounter. So let's say that you are driving to your campus, right, and you are going to present at the Campus Space Committee in about half an hour. And this is a committee you don't like very much, kind of boring, but today is very important because you're giving a PowerPoint deck that is going to maybe get some more space for your unit, and you're going to be the hero if you bring that home, right? So you are 2 miles from campus, 30 minutes out from this meeting, and your old green Subaru belches gray smoke and makes a terrible noise and dies on the side of the road. You have $8 in your pocket, a credit card, and a cell phone with about 10% battery life in it. Okay? So what do you, think about for a second, what do you do? You what? Hitchhike? Okay. And you could probably come up with some different solutions, right? But think about for a second, there's some aspects of that little scenario that matter and some that really don't. So what are some aspects of that problem that matter, that you really are kind of the linchpin of what you can and can't do in that situation? The time constraint and distance, the cell phone, right? Okay, and there's lots of different ways to solve the problem. There isn't just one good way. You can call a colleague and say, hey, can you present this for me? You could call the committee and say, can you put it off? You can hitchhike. You could call an Uber. There's different things you can do. But the point is that you've been an expert at solving those kinds of problems for a while, since you've been adulting for some time. And you're able to pull those out. Somebody who's not an expert with those, they're going to be confused by, well, does the color of the car matter? Does the color of the smoke matter? Which is another really good question, right? And if you're doing that, if you can't drill down to that underlying structure of the problem, not only are you not going to be more efficient, you aren't going to see that this is really the same as other kinds of problems, such as I have a court date and my car is broken down, or I'm connecting on 2 flights and I don't have enough time. Those problems have things in common, and that's what we mean by drilling down to the underlying structure. And when you get a lot of practice in solving problems one after the other, where the surface parts are different but the underlying structure is the same, that's where you become not just more expert, but more able to apply that flexibly across contexts. Now, critical thinking is another one that is particularly tough to address and comes with its own host of special considerations and issues. And I think it's very informative to talk to our colleagues, and hopefully we will be able to, later today in our conversations, about why that is. Now, one of the things about critical thinking that's particularly important for teachers to consider is that here again, there isn't one common definition. That's something that struck me when I got into the critical thinking literature. And I'm now comfortable with that fact. I think that's okay that we don't have one. I know there's lots of good definitions that float around out there, but I think that when we go to teach it, it really matters to bring it down to the level of what does it look like to me when my students are thinking critically. So reflecting on that skill first, figuring out what it looks like, and then, just like with other thinking skills, building in lots of opportunities where students are pressed to carry out those exact skills is what's important for teaching critical thinking. So, as I said, I'm hoping that later today you can get into some of these discussions about critical thinking. I think in the interest of time we aren't going to open up that discussion today. But in particular, thinking about when do students miss out on the deep structure of the problem? Where do they have difficulty in saying, yes, this is one of those problems where I have to apply my critical thinking? And do they even know when to apply critical thinking? Critical thinking is also hard because it's a when-to, not just a how-to problem. That it's effortful, right? So it feels this way subjectively, and it does seem to be true, that it's harder. It's simply harder than falling back on things like, here's my personal experience. And I'll just leave this one here for you to talk about as well. When are students actually motivated to maintain some of those illogical beliefs, and why? So sometimes it's not enough to just say, oh, here's where your thinking is incorrect, let me correct that for you. There are other motivations to keep that up. So let's go ahead to some application ideas. I do think that teaching thinking really starts with reflection. All right, what is that skill? What do you want students to be able to do, not just know at the end of the course? And do you have enough learning activities and opportunities where students are actually practicing those skills? And I know in my own teaching, almost every time I ask myself this question, the answer is no. I need to build in more opportunities. Aiming for transfer. right? Similarly, if we want students to think flexibly, if we want them to be able to apply this to the next module, the next chapter, the next course, and to their lives, then they really, really need to master that, and they need to use those skills across a lot of different problems. And here again, quizzing is kind of a twofer. I don't think we know exactly why this is yet, but having lots of opportunities to quiz oneself on information also seems to support the ability to use that information flexibly across different contexts. And very lastly today, I want us to be thinking about other ways besides just problem solving, just homework, and just quizzing to build those thinking skills. So things like simulations, scenarios, case studies. How many people in here use some variation on case studies, problem-based learning, right, where students are actually role-playing out, beginning to end, how they would apply information or carry out a skill? I think that this is going to be an important and exciting new avenue, sort of a new trend as in innovation and teaching going forward. Now, there are lots of tools that you can buy or incorporate into your course, many of them discipline-specific, where students can simulate information or role play. Things like Sniffy the Rat in psychology. It's an animated rat inside of a little training cage, and you can feed it pellets and train it to do things. That's great. But scenarios and simulations don't have to be high-tech. And so lastly today, I wanted to share with you just an example of a sort of a not quite low-tech, not quite high-tech, somewhere in between simulation that I think exemplifies this mentality of helping students develop their thinking in a really creative way. So this is one that I picked up at an event much like this one today at SUNY Oswego from my now colleague Rebecca Mushter. And she told me about something that she was doing in her web media course, a course where students learn to build websites that not just function, but also use good design principles and so on. Now, like you would do in many of these sorts of courses, her students are assigned a pretend client, and they have to build a website for their pretend client, right? But importantly, her students' clients don't just come with parameters, you know, what they want in their website. They also come with personalities. So to reinforce the skill of actually being able to build a website for a client and communicate with that client through email, in a little touch of realism, she sets up individual email addresses for them. So when I send in my work about my website and say, hey, how do you like this front page or this design, I'm not sending it to her, I'm actually typing out my pretend client's name and address. Now she's on the other end of that, and she role plays these different personalities and personas with the students. And as we all know, if we've ever worked with clients, sometimes what they say they want, what they actually want are two different things. And so that plays out in the assignment too. And so part of what students are doing is not just building, but presenting that. And this one touch of realism is really compelling to students. So much so that she says that every now and again, it doesn't happen often, but a student will come to her and complain, oh, my client is being so unreasonable. What am I going to do about that? And she has to remind them, yeah, that's me. And like any good simulation, if it really goes badly, she can write back as herself and say, okay, let's try that one again and look at how you interact with that client. So if we get creative, we can use even very simple affordances of our technology to provide these opportunities to students to actually use the skills and not just acquire the information, but to do both together. All right, so with that, I think we have some time for Q&A, and I hope to interact with many of you today and hear more about your ideas. So thank you for your attention.